the entire edifice of these Islamic finance institutions developed out of that debate about interest in banking. So I mean, this old debate has, from the time that banks had been invented, basically modern banks, and from the 1800s and even before, where we have that traditional contemporary institutions of banking and interest bearing loans, we've had that debate, and a great deal of material have been written about it. And so many fatwa. So, I mean, a huge body of literature. Islamic banking and Islamic finance, which developed in direct response to this debate, has had very, very mixed success record. There's some, for instance, some very famous lawsuits that came out of Britain, where Islamic finance companies were basically charging what amounted to an interest, although they didn't call it an interest. They call it, some form of murabaha or another. And courts condemned these companies for, in effect, overcharging their clients more than a traditional mortgage would have charged. The problem is this, and to take this, things back to its roots. Usury, the prohibition on interest, it all comes from the field of riba. Usury. Usury is not just condemned in Islamic law, it's condemned in Jewish law. The problem with Jewish law is that Jewish law created an exception when Jews are dealing with non-Jews. So it basically said that Jews can charge non-Jews interest. The prohibition against usury doesn't apply to interaction between Jews and non-Jews. That, of course, there are various opinions within Jewish law. In Christianity, things became diluted because although canon law prohibits usury, like all religious traditions, the whole role of law and law as a possible obstacle to salvation became compromised in Christian theology, because in Christian theology, if all you need to do is accept the Savior, Jesus as your Savior, then, God is going to forgive whatever usurious practices you engage in, and that diluted a whole great deal of issue. Although, if you talk to hard-nosed canonists, the people who truly believe in canon law, they'll tell you usury is forbidden. It's a sin. Okay. So that's the funny thing, is that all the religious traditions condemn usury. And not only that, but even the common law and civil law system condemn usury as well. Why? What is so awful about usury? Well, what's so awful about usury is that it reaffirms institutions of dominance and oppression in society, because those who have exploit the need of those who do not have and say, we will give you money to circulate, but you have to pay it back to us extra. So, as a rich person, which is exactly what's happening all over our society, where wealthy people sit in their offices, on their behinds all day, and they have working people go out there and work, and they make money basically by by supplying currency. They don't engage in any form of useful labor. All they do is they provide currency, and because they provide currency, they make profits, and then the rich remain rich and get richer, and the poor get more and more in debt and never get out of their poverty. So and there are two types of ribas that the jurists talk about: riba al-fadl and riba al-nasi'a. I don't want to get into it, because that's a very, very long juristic discussion. But in essence, what is so horrible about usury are the institutions of oppression and exploitation. You don't want, it's the same thing, with gold. We say it's the principle. We don't want people to hoard wealth. You don't want people to be able to exploit the need of others to make profits without labor, without the investment of labor or even the investment of risk. Because what that does is that it creates the institutions of power that we see all around society. Institutions where there is an elite that owns most of the wealth. They keep making their wealth grow larger and larger without taking any risks, without investing any labor, without engaging in any opportunity risks. And while the common folks are the ones that take all the risks, the ones who could lose their health, the ones who could get sick, and so on. So now, the issue is this, and this is why this has remained such an entrenched issue. The issue is this: to be real and to be honest when we talk about things. The Islamic civilization, we allowed the Islamic civilization to crumble. We allowed the caliphate to end. We allowed Muslims to break into a million different nation states, each nation state having its own currency, which makes these Muslim countries dependent and weak, because each Muslim country has its own currency against a very powerful currency like the dollar or like the euro, which means what? It means that the institutions of colonialism, which brought the banking system to the Muslim world, remain the dominant institutions. And you create an Islamic finance institution today, but the Islamic finance organization can't really work outside the world financial system that is dependent on the dollar and on the euro. If you really want to challenge that exploitative usury system, don't do business using the dollar. Don't do business using the yen. You start breaking the monopoly, and you start then talking about a real banking system that could potentially present a different paradigm than the banking system that could already exist. But it is rather infantile, in my opinion. It's very infantile to say, oh, well, we're not going to challenge the institutions of the world as it is. We're not going to demand that those who take care of Mecca and Medina, do anything other than continue selling oil and using the dollar, continue at the world stage. Countries deal with the World Bank, and we just do these little cosmetic things of, oh, well, instead of calling it an interest-bearing loan, we'll say that, we buy the property and then you sell it back, and then we sell it back to you, and then we construct the selling price as higher than blah, blah, and so on and so forth, the way we construct Islamic, and then say that somehow we're getting around the usury issue. None of it is real to me. It's like child's play. we are just avoiding the real issues. The real issues are the way that the rich monopolize wealth, and that they continue their positions of privilege and power, and that their positions of privilege and power are never challenged. They're not challenged by Muslim institutions. They're not challenged by any Islamic finance institution that we've created in the past 50 years. They're not challenged by Muslim countries that sell oil. They're not challenged by Muslim countries that borrow from the World Bank. They're not challenged even because of even the way we approach economy is just so, and economics is so infantile. So what I'm telling you is, to be very blunt about it, what I've seen in my lifetime is a lot of people who created Islamic banks and Islamic finance organizations have turned it into businesses that they profit from. And that they sell this dogma about, non-riba institutions to overcharge Muslims, not to help Muslims, not to fight exploitation, but to actually reaffirm the institutions of exploitation, and sometimes making it worse, like these lawsuits in England that I studied, and was very dismayed and disheartened. I definitely have a mortgage with a bank that, with a regular bank. I don't even know which bank, but I have a mortgage, so I'm not going to pretend that I don't have a mortgage. And the reason I have a mortgage is that I knew that if I had gone to one of the so-called Islamic institutions, I would have ended up paying more, and with financial institutions that are often run by people that are less reliable, without federal insurance or other forms of financial insurance that makes me as a consumer secure. And my understanding of Sharia and why God prohibited riba is for the sake of the consumer. It's not for the sake of the technicality of the law. It's not just to say we prohibited riba, but it's to protect the poor. And I wish we can challenge and we can break the world financial system that is premised on the exploitation of the poor. But that challenge is not going to be carried out with cosmetic changes that we call Islamic banking that we see today. So no, I don't think it's a matter of balancing between harm and good, as that might have been the way it was explained to you, because that's the way Muslims think you can do Islamic law. Oh, what Islamic law is balancing harm and good. That's not what law is. Law is far more complex than that. Law, it has objectives and has operative causes and have contingencies and have a adilla that you have to evaluate. It's not just a matter of balancing harm and good. It's a matter of understanding why the law is there. And my opinion, Allahu A'lam, Allah knows best, but my opinion is, for Muslims who don't live in Muslim countries, especially for those who don't live in Muslim countries, Muslim countries raise a whole type of set of different issues. Among them, for instance, if you deal with Islamic banking, can you end up like my mother put all her life savings in an Islamic bank, but then the Egyptian government came and stole all the money because of the battle between the Islamists and the government in Egypt. And so my mother lost all her life savings because the Egyptian government stole it. Now, if in hindsight, I would have told my mother, put your money in a regular bank, because of the political instability and insecurity that exists in a country like Egypt, where Islamic banks can be targeted overnight just because the government wants to steal the money of the Islamists. But for Muslims living in the West, the issue of, if you go take a loan from a mob, from the Mafia, where they charge 50% interest and 60% interest and 70% interest, I will tell you, no, that is clear usury. But interest within the banking system in the world government in the world banking network that currently exists, I can't call that what was intended behind riba. I mean, there needs to be a total approach to reforming this. Part of it is run for Congress and pass better usury laws. I mean, the problem is usury laws have allowed the charging of up to 30% interest, and they don't call it usury. Part of it is that as Muslims, what is far more effective is to start a movement where we change the laws, where we define usury in a more Islamic way, so that, for instance, charging more than 10% would be usury instead of 30%. I think that would be a far greater Islamically relevant response than saying, well, no, I'm just not going to take a mortgage, or I'm not going to... well, Allahu Alam. I mean, I know that some people are just not comfortable, and whatever, regardless of what you say, they just don't want to deal with interest, and I respect that. But I study the problem from a comprehensive perspective, and I look at the reason we have the law and the stated logic of the law, and I'm not convinced that there is an alternative to interest banking, a reasonable alternative, unless we go and actually start changing usury laws within the United States, and then within the world system, and then perhaps start reforming the banking system so it's not so exploitative. The issue is exploitation, people. Whether that exploitation uses the word riba or interest, or doesn't use the word interest. So I am not comforted by an Islamic financial institution that still exploits people, but just doesn't use the word interest. That doesn't do it for me.